That's cool. I look like Cat Von D. Interesting. Really? What's that? Hmm. Come for us.
To politics now, fireworks in the legislature again today as the premier doubled down and refused to apologize again for comments he made about new immigrants coming to Ontario. On Monday, he said only hard-working ones were welcome and for others to go elsewhere.
I'm the biggest pro-immigrant premier we've ever seen here.
Immigrants often come to Canada with nothing. And yes, they face racism and racist stereotypes. And instead of recognizing this struggle, the Premier of Ontario made comments that feed into this division and into these racist stereotypes. A dog whistle that is hurtful and wrong.
I was inundated from people from Brampton, from your community, from the Sikh community, that said you were bang on.
It's pretty clear Doug Ford is not going to apologize for what the opposition is calling divisive and callous comments. This is now day 3 of the controversy, but there are also other issues I need to tell you about. A big one is mandatory vaccines for frontline healthcare workers.
Why is the Premier refusing to make vaccinations mandatory for frontline healthcare and education workers?
The Science Advisory Table is recommending the province make them mandatory. The health minister says a decision is coming soon.
It's not a simple standalone issue. We understand that there will be some people that will not be vaccinated, so we have to weigh the benefits of mandatory vaccination versus the job losses.
However, the Science Advisory Table has concluded a mandate would actually reduce the risk of a staffing shortage.
Speaker, all we know so far is that the House Leader will be topped up with close to about $30,000. That's about 6 months worth of hardworking nurses' salary.
Public sector workers may be surprised to learn PC House Leader Paul Calandra got a promotion to Minister of Legislative Affairs, which comes with a $27,000 raise, while they are held to a 1% wage increase under the Ford government's Bill 124. It had the finance minister dancing around the question of why a minister gets a significant raise when nurses who worked under extreme conditions during COVID are only getting a 1% increase.
Well, I bought coffee for hardworking emergency care nurses last Thursday, and I had three things that I said to them. Thank you, and thank you.
The finance minister will release his fall economic statement on November 4th. He said today he's concerned about inflation, which rose 4.4% last month on a year-over-year basis, and called this a challenging environment.
Question: did the teardown of the Gardner Expressway ramp at Logan Avenue on the East End take down an important sound barrier? That's what residents are asking after several sleepless nights.
During the day, all is fairly quiet in Leslieville, but on a few nights,
like a bass, hearing that constant bass going around.
people are losing sleep here.
I even went outside of my house coat to find out where it was coming from, because it was keeping me awake.
It's coming from here, City View Drive-In, a concert venue at Polson Pier.
I just can't believe I can hear it from here.
That's because Cheryl Tucker lives more than 2 kilometers away from the venue. But concerts were held at the pier last year.
I've never heard it. I've lived here over 4 years.
So what's changed? Well, this massive structure is no longer here.
It leaves this huge empty space down like at Cherry Street.
The Gardner ramp at Logan Avenue, once a barrier between Leslieville and the lakeshore, was removed this summer. Some residents wonder if that demolition also removed a sound barrier. We asked Professor Ramani Ramakrishnan with Ryerson University.
My specialty is acoustics, aeroacoustics, and noise control.
While he would need to do a full visit to the site to be sure, he's not certain the ramp blocked the sound.
Anytime you have a gap, the idea in acoustics is if you have a 10% opening, 90 to 95% of the sound will come through.
The ramp, given how it was on columns, there was a lot of open space. Chances are that was not a proper sound barrier.
I don't believe so.
While the ramp may not have blocked sound, did the traffic on it?
The traffic on the ramp could actually mask the sound. Yes, that's a possibility.
Regardless, people who live in these neighborhoods want something done.
Has your office heard a thing or two about the complaints?
Whoa! There's been over 200 complaints altogether to my office and into 311.
Councillor Paula Fletcher represents Leslieville, vowing to make changes.
I need to make sure that people who have complained on this side, the river in Leslieville, are being taken into account.
She'll be meeting with city staff to go over the noise ordinance. City View Drive-In did not respond to requests for comment, but nobody is calling for the party to end. Some actually enjoy the noise.
It's not like it's happening every night. People do need the joy as well and the celebration. So hopefully we can all make space for that.
Many are just hoping for a happy and less noisy compromise.
We don't want to shut you down. We just want to shut you up.
A good acoustic consultant can give very good recommendations for them to control the noise. I mean, it is going to cost some money, but if they're making enough money, they should spend that money to be a good corporate citizen.
If you want to sound off, have an issue, story, or question you'd like us to look into, we'd love to hear from you as always. Reach out to us by visiting the Speaker's Corner tab on the City News website. In Toronto, Pat Taney, City News.
He won the most votes in last month's federal election, but alas for Conservatives, not the most seats. When Parliament reconvenes next month, Aaron O'Toole will resume his role as Leader of Her Majesty's Loyal Opposition. This has been a whirlwind last year and a half for the MP from Durham, winning his party's leadership during a global pandemic, getting COVID himself, and appearing to have the Liberals very much on the run during the election campaign. Now he and his fellow Conservatives have to figure out if he's the right guy to lead the party going forward. And with that, we welcome for his first one-on-one interview since the election, Conservative Party leader Aaron O'Toole. Very nice to have you in that chair.
Good to be back with you, Steve. My
first real interview winning leadership was with you, but I was in a hotel room.
Yes, I remember
giving that interview.
I do remember that. Well, we should do a little housekeeping off the top here because you are, in fact, the one and only guest we have actually had in this studio in the last 19 months. We somehow got a special exemption for you, I think because we're both double vaxxed. We've both had COVID. We're 6 feet apart right now. We do have 3 camera operators in the studio right now. They are all double vaxxed and they are all masked up and they are all 6 feet apart. So we think we're pretty safe right now and everything's kosher going forward.
And I won't speak moistly either, Steve.
I know what that's a reference to. Very good. Sheldon, our director, if you would, let's put the first graphic up, please, because we want to remind everybody what the people of Canada had to say on the 20th of September. They gave the Liberals, in their wisdom, 160 seats, the Conservatives 119, the Bloc Québécois 32, New Democrats 25, and the Green Party 2 seats. Aaron, what do you think Canadians said with their votes on the 20th of September?
Well, Mr. Trudeau spent $600 million on an election to get virtually the same parliament, Steve. Obviously, I'm disappointed. I thought I put forward a campaign to talk about change, talk about our economic risks coming out of COVID. But the result really was people were still nervous about the pandemic. And the last week, they saw some provinces having difficulties. And I think many people that were kicking the tires with the Conservatives didn't buy the car. And so we have to continue to do the hard work needed to win the trust of those people, and I'm committed to do that as leader.
Did you think you'd win more than 119 seats at the beginning of the election campaign?
Well, people were predicting the demise of the Conservative Party. They said we'd go down to 70 seats. One prognosticator said I wouldn't win my own seat in Durham. And
yeah, but at some point it looked like you were going to win the whole thing.
We were doing very well in the middle when we were talking about our economic recovery. We were talking about inflation, which is, again, hitting records today, Steve. So when we were talking about the way forward, securing the future, we were winning. But people got nervous again at the end of the campaign. Mr. Trudeau called the campaign knowing the modeling would do that. And so he used COVID for his political advantage. I thought it was wrong to have a pandemic election. I still think that. But we have to learn the lessons from the campaign. There were a number of ridings that were surprises. We lost votes in the Chinese-Canadian community, for example. There's a number of reasons for that we're exploring. And as leader, I'm committed to making sure we learn the lessons because our country needs a stronger economy, a prosperous future, an ethical government, and they're not getting that with the Trudeau Liberals.
You say when you were in first place in the polls, people got nervous. What did they get nervous about in your view?
Mainly about COVID. You know, it was unprecedented for the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, to pick fights with about 5 different premiers throughout the course of an election. You know, mocking their response or criticizing their actions. That's not a sign of leadership, and it explains why we have national unity crisis in this country right now. But it worked politically. People were nervous about COVID, particularly coming in to seeing ICUs being filled up in Alberta, for example. Rather than working together, Mr. Trudeau used that fear. I don't think that's leadership, but it produced a lot of people that were looking at us not voting for us. And I've got to do better to secure that vote. We did grow the people that were considering voting. So our voter universe went up dramatically, but we didn't seal the deal, particularly here in Southern Ontario. And as a kid from Southern Ontario, I do feel responsible for not meeting what I wanted to do, but I know it's there next time.
We'll pursue Southern Ontario and the rest of the province for that matter in a moment. But I do want to ask you this. You know, Justin Trudeau really seemed vulnerable the last 2 elections, both yours and Andrew Scheer's. I mean, he got the lowest percentage of the total vote, I think, in Canadian history for anybody who won an election. But he did win. He did win in both. He got 2 minority governments. And as much as you disagree with him, do you have to acknowledge that at some level, somehow, he has established enough of a connection with enough Canadians that they want him?
Well, you know, I've joked with my wife, Rebecca, you know, I've been to Toronto for some meetings and some speeches. And if I counted all the people saying, hey, I voted for you, we need to replace Mr. Trudeau, I wonder how I lost the election, Steve, because people are very dissatisfied with Mr. Trudeau. And his surfing trip to Tofino on the first day of Truth and Reconciliation was another example of how he's constantly letting us down. But we do have to recognize they have been able to very effectively deliver their vote
and demonize others. If you look at the end of the race, some of the attacks they were shelving on me, claiming Jagmeet Singh couldn't be a spot for some voters on the left and trying to consolidate. So they use fear and wedge politics better than I think any political party in the Western world, Steve. And does that mean we jump in and do that same type of division? I tried not to. We're going to continue to talk policy. We think the economy is on life support right now. If you look at the risk of interest rates going up, you look at companies leaving and not having confidence in Canada.
If you look at jobs, though, all the jobs have come back, but we're told anyway.
We have job shortages across the country. You know, it's time to end the CERB, Steve. You know, Mr. Trudeau has delayed the tough decisions of changing government supports within the pandemic because he was also buying votes in some cases, sending checks to seniors days before an election. Is that the best way to help the vulnerable seniors, for example? There was probably a lot of spending that wasn't needed, but Mr. Trudeau was buying votes. So we have to put forward a plan to get our economy going, making sure Canadian prosperity is there for our kids and grandchildren. I think after the pandemic, when people look at the parties on their merits without COVID lingering over anyone, we win that election.
I want to talk to you about MTV and not the video channel. I want to talk to you about Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver. Because in the biggest cities in this country, the Conservative Party won very, very few seats, as you know. And if you like, take a look at the monitor over there, because we're going to put up a map of the Greater Toronto Area, which you know very well. That little patch of blue on the east end there, I think that's your riding in Durham. But again, you haven't got much company up there. The Liberals, for a whole bunch of reasons, I guess, are just, it's a fortress for the Liberal Party in the Greater Toronto Area and through much of Ontario. What is preventing you, in your judgment, from connecting more with urban voters across this country?
Well, we're doing analysis of our own exit polling, Steve. Those challenges are real. I'm not going to mask them. Some of the decisions I made as leader in the last year were meant to show Canadians that whether it was climate change, whether it was Indigenous reconciliation, whether it was LGBTQ rights, I was going to make sure that the Conservatives were there to not just present ideas, but to make sure we had candidates from the LGBTQ community. Our new MP in Thornhill, for example, is another member of that community joining our caucus. Melissa Landsman,
guest on this program.
A great Conservative activist and advisor. She's now in our caucus. She's going to be fantastic. We need to make sure those communities know we're taking issues they care about seriously and that we have Conservative solutions. So your map shows we've got a lot of work still to do, Steve. The polls, when they were looking good midway through, people in those ridings were looking at us. And I really do think, had we not had the spike in ICUs and COVID roar back, some of the division caused by Mr. Trudeau and Mr. Bernier on the question of vaccines, would it have been a different result? Perhaps. But we lost. I'm the leader. I'm responsible. But our project to make sure that we reach out to voters in urban and suburban Canada is the fundamental question our party has to tackle before the next election.
Since you mentioned Maxime Bernier, let me follow up with a question on him and his People's Party. Can you win an election in this country if he's eating 6 to 8% of your lunch each time out?
He's not eating 6 to 8% of our lunch. And this is something some pollsters are already looking at, we've looked at. There is a portion of his vote that is Conservative or right of center voter, libertarian, absolutely. And I do think, working better to show some of our ideas on effective government, fiscal responsibility can probably bring some people back. But there were many candidates who were kind of anti-GMO people. There were kind of anti sort of more green type voters running as PPC candidates. He got people that hadn't voted in the past to vote. Motivated largely on the vaccine question.
So he's not a deterrent to your electoral success?
No, and we're not going to use the division and quite frankly, his approach is divisive and divides the country, scares people in some cases. We want to be the center-right option for Canadians concerned about their economic future, concerned about safety in their community, these sorts of things. But we are analyzing all votes because I think we need to also have those liberal conservative switchers open to voting for us on economic grounds.
Do they still exist? I know, I'm steeped in the history of this province and the so-called blue grits / red Tories, who would be those liberal conservative switchers who, if they sort of got tired of the Liberals, might go to you. But I've been told by so many Conservatives over the years, they don't exist anymore. What do you say on that?
They do exist. In fact, I've been speaking with many of them in the last few days here in the Toronto business community, getting ideas for the economic issues facing the return of Parliament. They want to see a strong economy. They want to see a private sector. They want to see risk-taking and innovation in Canada. But they're socially progressive. They also wanted to see policies on the environment and other issues. We are providing that, but as a new leader doing everything through Zoom or my appearance on the agenda from a hotel room, not here in studio, it was a tough year to show people Conservatives were putting forward ideas, even on areas where people think we fell short. Our housing policy was probably the best in the last election. We had commentators who hadn't been generous to us in the last few years saying, Conservative Party has the best set of policies for the housing crisis in the GTA and in Vancouver. We need to continue to show people that we're going to tackle the issues they care about, because there's a lot of voters in that realm, because Mr. Trudeau is running more like a traditional NDP prime minister, not as an inheritor of the Paul Martin fiscal approach to governance. So we've got an opportunity with those urban and suburban voters.
Let's talk leadership. How firm do you think your grasp of the leadership of your party is right now?
Strong. We're united. We're disappointed. No one more so than me, Steve. But we came very close and saw our vote share go up in many ridings that were literally a few percentage points difference would have elected Conservatives. In ridings like Kenora and Northern Ontario, we're seeing our vote go up. In parts of the Windsor area, vote go up. Our outreach to unions and to working Canadians going very well. In fact, we're giving Charlie Angus and people like that a run for their money. And I'm going to predict to you, we're going to win more seats in Northern Ontario next time.
Timmins? James Bay?
Timmins, James Bay, we were within 100 votes in Sault Ste. Marie, and the Steelworker Local endorsed our Conservative candidate. So our outreach is working, Steve, but we also need to show that we can keep the party and the country united. So we're doing an exercise to make sure we learn why we fell short. We have one of our MPs, James Cumming, who lost in Edmonton, doing a full review, including a review on me.
What do you want to hear from him?
How to tackle those maps in Vancouver, Montreal, Toronto, how to make sure we not just get people to kick the tires, because we're approaching now 50% of the population considering voting for us, but we didn't close the deal. How can we do that? Where did we fall short? We had some stumbles throughout the campaign as well, but overall ran a fairly professional campaign. Where can we improve? I've been involved in 360 reviews in the private sector, lessons learned in my military career. We have to apply that politically. But our caucus is united, and I've been quite reassured by how positive they are on us winning the next election.
Andrew Scheer was tossed out pretty quickly after he lost the last election. Are you sitting here tonight telling us for sure that if you and I have a conversation in 3 months' time, you're still going to be the leader?
I look forward to that conversation in 3 months' time as leader, Steve, and hopefully again in the studio, so you can have a few more guests in here. Andrew, who's still a great member of our caucus, made the decision himself. Sure, there was a lot of swirl and difficulty.
He made the decision because they came at him with knives over and over and over again.
It is, sometimes a part of our party's DNA to do this to ourselves. I don't see that happening this time. And in fact, we had, in the words of some of my colleagues, one of the most productive post-election caucus meetings we've ever had. And I'm responsible for when we fell short. The buck stops with me. But people also know we were close to sealing the deal. They knew that COVID came back. We did not politicize vaccines. And it was a tough position to be in to see Mr. Trudeau, who a few months earlier was praising me when my wife Rebecca and I publicly got our vaccinations before he did. He praising me a few months ago and calling me an anti-vaxxer in the middle of the campaign. It was disappointing, but that's the Liberal approach to politics. I think if people saw how we conducted ourselves and our economic vision coming out of COVID, if COVID isn't the ballot question next time, Steve, we win.
I mean, I don't know why he said it, but he may have said it because there were some of your members, there were some of your candidates who hadn't been vaccinated or weren't indicating that they would get vaccinated. And now, of course, the Speaker of Parliament has decided that everybody, all members, have to be vaccinated if they want to go into the building. All the other parties are on the record as having said that all their people are vaccinated. You can't say that, right?
We've always said that vaccines are critical and we need to encourage as many people to get vaccinated as possible. And our party encourages that.
Some of your members aren't.
What we've said is it is a personal health choice. And when we're trying to tackle that remaining 10% of our society that may be not vaccinated has some hesitancy, the way you tackle that is by addressing it. And we've got a plan actually to do that without dividing people or having an us versus them. But the BOIE, the speaker, as you said, has decided, and Conservatives, as we always have, will respect all public health guidance, including in our own conduct as members of Parliament. We've always said that accommodating folks, a small number, using rapid testing and other measures is fair. I think it's actually in compliance with the Charter as well. And I look at the difficult situation with healthcare workers. You know, we see shortages, we see burnout. Should we be trying as much as possible to deal with hesitancy without pink slips by working with a single dose non-mRNA vaccine, for example?
Your position may be very reasonable, but the Speaker, the Board of the Internal Economy of Parliament has still said, tough, that the O'Toole formula isn't good enough. We need everybody vaccinated. You can't say everybody in your caucus is vaccinated.
We can say that we will follow all public health guidance. So Steve, the BOIE and the Speaker have ruled, and we will respect that, of course. We also think, though, that we have to look at not dividing people on this issue. It is difficult to see places where we're seeing people terminated, where in some cases, I think if we work smart and use all the tools we have, we could probably avoid these sort of confrontations with just not politicizing vaccinations.
I do want to circle back to you. I want to circle back to the issue of you because, well, put it this way. I don't know what James Cumming, your former MP from Alberta, is going to come back with, but I suspect part of it is going to be Erin O'Toole. I've known you for 20 years. I always thought of you as a sort of a moderate red Tory. But when you ran for the leadership of the party, you ran as a true blue Conservative. You hit all those hot buttons that true blue Conservatives love about cancel culture and privatizing CBC television and that kind of thing. And then when the election campaign started, you made a very deliberate decision to move your party to the more moderate middle in order to appeal to those liberal Tory switchers that you referred to earlier. I wonder if I don't know, I'm just asking. I wonder if part of your problem here is that Canadians aren't clear in their own minds about what kind of a Conservative you are.
Well, I think there's some truth to what you're saying. Canadians not sure. They still don't know me as well as they think they might. In fact, our numbers went up dramatically as people got to know me, Steve. But our own exit polling said some of the people that considered us but didn't close the deal, they're telling us didn't know enough about Mr. O'Toole. So part of that is true. Part of it is not true. If you actually look at the leadership race, I'm a proud true blue Conservative, but I stand up for the rights of all Canadians. I have since the day I walked in the House of Commons. So I was even attacked for my position on LGBTQ rights, for example. But I'll make no apologies. I was in uniform to fight for all Canadians' rights in our institutions, and I will always do that. I said we'd fallen short on climate change, and we needed a serious approach to tackling climate change. It's an important issue for me as a parent as much as it is a Conservative. And I'm a true blue Conservative. I've served in the military. I've never asked for anything. I've put myself through school. You know my own background. I'm from Bowmanville. I'm always going to fight for people that need a voice. And I don't believe people that define conservatism in one way or another. What are you putting forward as leader? That's always how I've conducted myself. So I'm still as true blue today as I was then, Steve.
Okay, but some of the members of your party obviously do define conservatism in one way or another, even if you don't. And if they thought, I know Erin O'Toole, he's a true blue Conservative who has these small c conservative views on a whole range of issues, and I like that about him. And then they see a guy who's trying to sort of drag, in some cases, kicking and screaming members of the party more to the center to broaden your appeal. Can you understand why they would be quizzical about what kind of Tory you are?
Yes. And in fact, I don't profess that we were perfect. In fact, when I launched a very comprehensive climate change policy that has a price on carbon, but not a carbon tax, we stumbled a bit on how that got out. It was leaked. I hadn't been able to brief my caucus. The caucus felt disappointed by that. But in the election campaign, I'll tell you, I got a lot of praise from people saying, hey, it was great to see the Conservatives brought up an innovative approach to meet our Paris targets without the economic disruption of Mr. Trudeau's carbon tax. I can do that better next time by, I think, engaging caucus better, by making sure we can get out and explain these issues better. But that some of those issues are being used as Aaron O'Toole departing from where he was in the leadership. But if you look, I was criticizing the leadership for saying we needed to be more serious on climate change. I want those urban voters in the maps you showed, Steve, to know that on any issue that is of concern to their family, the Conservatives of Canada will have a solution for you. It will be free market based. It will be smaller government. It's not going to be an Ottawa knows best approach, but we have to show we're tackling the issues of 2021.
Speaking of Ottawa, I gather you have a meeting with the Prime Minister scheduled at some point to talk about how things are going to work in this minority parliament going forward. Can you peel back the curtain a bit on how that works? Do you guys meet in person or do you do it on Zoom? Do you walk into that meeting with an agenda that you want to talk about? Do you do more listening than talking? Just help us understand how that's going to work.
Well, he doesn't reach out very often, to be honest, but we are having a phone call today about the return of Parliament. And I'm very concerned about the economy. We saw inflation continuing to go up. We really think it's time to wind down the CERB and transition all the national support programs into more targeted sector support. We ran on this. So restaurants, hospitality, tourism, some of the sectors that will continue to hurt, Steve, that's where the support needs to go. But there's labor shortages. We can't just continue to have the CERB. It's disrupting our labor market. So I'm going to be talking to him about that. I really do think Parliament should be back sooner. It's a month since the election, and we're not going back for another month. Why the delay? He called this urgent pandemic once in a generation election, and then he's gone surfing and he's not taken his job seriously. So we'll be asking for him to put forward more of an agenda. And anytime we can work in the best interest of the country, particularly to help get vaccination rates up, we will work cross-party. But we're also going to project some of our own ideas based on the recovery plan that we put out during the election. It's a minority parliament. Maybe we'll get some of our own ideas passed.
I'm not going to do a sort of pop quiz with you here, but I'm going to mention a bunch of names here, all of whom you will know, and all of whom had something in common with you. Stephen Harper, Dalton McGuinty, Bob Ray, Mike Harris, Lester Pearson. You know what they all have in common with you?
They all won on their second election?
Correct. They all lost the first time out, but they won. They learned some valuable lessons in losing the first time out, and they won the second time round. I want to know what valuable lesson you learned about yourself, about how you campaign, about how you relate to Canadians, that you think will be valuable for next time, presuming you get a next time, that you think might help you win next time.
I think we have to get into our urban and suburban ridings better. We did plan a very conservative or cautious campaign because of COVID health restrictions, Steve. So Mr. Trudeau broke many health rules in a pandemic election. We were extra cautious. I think we paid a bit of the price for that. I should have been into some of the urban centers more, hearing from people more. We were trying to limit numbers and be very careful. But I heard constantly from people, I didn't know much about you. I heard you answer questions. I heard you, on your stump speech. So that was something I've got to do better on. I do think we need to make sure that we have candidates that reflect all communities. We had the most diverse slate, but we lost some MPs that represented diversity in our party. So that's something that we have to work on as a party. And, everything I do as leader in terms of how we develop policy, I have to engage the grassroots and our caucus even better than we have. So it's been a tough year as a COVID leader that's given my Canadian Club speech, not at the Royal York, like tradition going back to Diefenbaker, but on Zoom. I'm looking forward to these real interactions. I'm going to be stronger next time, but I want Canadians that were considering us, stay tuned. It's a Conservative Party that's going to be here to fight for you.
I hope you don't take this as damning with faint praise, but I will say you have been far more responsive in answering my questions today during this interview than you were, say, with the gaggle of reporters who followed you around during the election campaign, when they would ask questions and you would get on message track and not be the slightest bit responsive to whatever it was they were asking you about. Has that been one of the things that you've learned over the last few months that you need to do? Actually be responsive to what people are asking, as opposed to just saying whatever the hell it is you want to say.
Well, I prefer in-depth interviews. That's why I love your program. It's one of my favorite shows because you're able to drill down. And in a campaign, when you have 36 days and I'm announcing our housing policy, do I want to talk about what they want to talk about, which is not what I'm announcing? There is a healthy to and fro. It sometimes frustrated the journalists that I was trying to get my message
Sometimes?
out. But
Maybe
I
all the
only
time.
have 36 days. And I often joke, Steve, I'm competing against a prime minister who people have known since he was born in 24 Sussex. I'm catching up and I had to get my message out. So there's learnings there too, 100%. It's why I prefer this. I'm going to be looking at doing some podcasts and other things where you can actually do a deeper dive. I'm a leader that not only reads the speech, I deliver, Steve. And that's where Mr. Trudeau and I are very different. He does not dive into the details on things. I do. And I think Canadians want a prime minister like that. So these more in-depth approaches rather than the firing line of a press conference, I think will work with my style better.
That's Aaron O'Toole. He's the leader of the Conservative Party of Canada. He's the member for Durham, and he's been the first guest we've had in this studio in 19 months, which we're very pleased about. Aaron, it's good to see you again. Thanks for coming in.
Great to be on the agenda, Steve. Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Pagan is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Having special powers used to mean having superhuman strength. But in the time of COVID, being superhuman takes on a new meaning, like being immune to all current and future forms of the virus. And that may be closer than we thought. One study in the US found some people have seemingly bulletproof protection from all variants of COVID-19 circulating at the moment. But what does it mean to be super immune, and how widespread could this protection be? I'm Ben Fazul, and welcome to our COVID-19 special and our superhero episode, or to be more precise, super immunity, one of the pandemic's great puzzles. Who has it? Could it stop the next major variant? And could it save us from outbreaks to come?
People who have survived a COVID-19 infection and were later vaccinated seem to be extremely well protected against all variants of the coronavirus. They have stronger antibodies and more of them compared to people who have only either recovered from or been vaccinated against COVID. The antibodies also seem to fend off additional viruses, according to researchers at one university in New York.
And altogether, the plasma is now able to fight not only SARS-CoV-2, but also related subretroviruses like those coming from bats or pangolins, and even to some extent the first SARS that emerged about 20 years ago.
However, the researchers only used data from 14 people vaccinated 1 year after they were infected with the coronavirus with either BioNTech or Moderna, which are both mRNA jabs. Now, scientists want to find out whether super immunity can be achieved with other vaccines, such as AstraZeneca. And most importantly, whether vaccinated people who have not previously had COVID-19 can build up this defense against other viruses as well.
So what we have to do now is to achieve the same results, the same breadth that you see following infection by vaccination alone. That's why I'm in great favor of the third dose. It will further induce antibody evolution and will make them even better. So we hopefully be approaching what you see following a natural infection.
The study has shown that the antibodies of the super immune can ward off viruses related to the coronavirus transmitted by pangolins or bats. It's possible that they may even be armed against the next pandemic.
It's very, very hard to predict, but at least it gives us an opportunity to appreciate that it is possible to mount responses that will target multiple coronaviruses. So it is it's achievable, and if we are able to reproduce those results with vaccines, then it bodes very well for the current pandemic, but also future pandemic by related coronaviruses.
But questions remain. For example, whether these super immunity antibodies are created if an infection follows a vaccination, or how long super immunity lasts at all.
The questions for our guest, Priyamvada Acharya, Director of the Division of Structural Biology at the Duke Human Vaccine Institute. It develops vaccines and therapies or therapeutics. Another study shows former SARS patients vaccinated against COVID may also have this super immunity. Just what sort of a breakthrough, or what sort of breakthroughs are we talking about here with these studies?
I think it's a very important finding because it gives proof of principle that it is possible to generate pan-coronavirus vaccines, and that somebody who had been exposed to a different coronavirus now with a dose of the current coronavirus vaccine is able to induce broad protection. So that is the proof of principle that a pan-coronavirus vaccine is feasible.
And can you tell us or give us an idea of how long this super immunity actually lasts?
I don't think these are new studies. I don't think we know it for sure yet, but if a vaccine is able to induce protection, and if a prior infection gives that memory to induce, to be able to react to the new vaccine and induce broad activity, broad immunity, that is promising. But how long it will last, it's a little bit hard to say now. But it seems like, going by what we have seen now, if there is a future infection in that patient, it will act like the immune system seeing another vaccine or another form of virus, and then it will mount the reaction we have seen with the vaccination. So I'm optimistic that it will be useful.
So do you also get super immunity antibodies if an infection follows a vaccination?
I do not think we know that yet. So it's hard to say, because in this case the person was exposed to SARS-CoV-1 many years back. But we've also heard reports that people who are infected with COVID-19 and then got the vaccination had better protection. So it is hard to say what it will be the other way around. But I would expect, if I were to hazard a guess, I would expect that a breakthrough infection after vaccination may provide some of similar benefits.
Does it tell us anything about the benefits of a booster shot, getting a third jab?
Getting a third jab will help the antibodies continuing to evolve, as we've heard. Whether it will confer this broad protection remains to be seen. I think what will happen is, and a lot of research is going into this to figure out strategies to induce broad protection. So I think the new immunogens, which are actually diverse, they may play a similar role. So whether the current booster, which is the same immunogen which was in the previous two doses, whether that induces broad protection or not is I think a little too early to say, but it will definitely allow the immune response to continue to evolve, and it will be useful for sure.
And the big question, how big a step are we taking towards a vaccine against all coronaviruses?
A lot of very smart people are working on this, and from what we have seen, there's a lot of proof of principle from the hybrid immunity findings that it is feasible. So I'm very, very optimistic that there will be a pan-coronavirus vaccine sooner rather than later.
And why don't we have this sort of thing against the flu? Can you explain that?
So one thing is flu evades. It drifts and shifts. So there is antigen, and then so there is natural drift, and that causes an antigenic shift, which causes the flu virus to evade the current vaccines. Plus, also the antibody response wanes quickly, and what happens then is the immune system has to rely on memory B cells, which takes some time to kick in. And we know that the flu virus it causes very rapid infection. So I think that's why we don't have this doesn't work so well against the flu due to a few things like antigenic drift and the fact that the immunity conferred by the flu vaccine wanes quickly.
Okay, we'll have to leave it there. Priyamvada Acharya, thank you very much. The Duke Human Vaccine Institute.
Thank you. Bye.
A question now about your immune response to the COVID vaccines with our very own Derek Williams.
Is vaccine immune response all about the levels of antibodies they induce? Or are there other factors to consider?
An antibody is a roughly Y-shaped protein produced by the body that's able to recognize and dock on to the outer surface of an invading pathogen like a virus. By docking on, the antibodies might neutralize it directly by blocking the mechanisms that allow it to invade a cell, or they might flag up the invader for destruction by other layers of the immune system's defenses. It takes some time for the immune system to learn how to tailor specific antibodies to specific pathogens. So the levels of those particular antibodies are often used as a kind of rule of thumb when it comes to judging immune status. If someone has a lot of the antibodies specific to SARS-CoV-2, then that's viewed as a sign that the person is unlikely to get a severe case of COVID-19.
But it's a lot more complicated than that because other immune system factors, in particular what are called B cells and T cells, they also play key roles in antibody production as well as long-term immunity.
Antibody levels will tend to drop off in the months after infection or vaccination, experts say, because your body doesn't keep churning out antibodies to every disease you've ever been exposed to at high levels forever. That would be a waste of resources. Instead, immune system cells store long-term information on known pathogens and how to make antibodies against them. If you're exposed then again later, they recognize the invader and they can quickly ramp back up antibody production and immune defenses. In talking about immune response or a lack of it, however, we tend to focus on antibody levels because they're a fairly straightforward metric to measure. But they're really just one factor in a very complex system.
And a few other COVID-related stories making news before we go. The head of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, says the European Union has exported 1 billion COVID vaccines produced here to over 150 countries since late last year. The EU has exported as many vaccines as have been given to the bloc's citizens. Malaysia's reported the lower new coronavirus cases since June, the first day below 6,000. It still has one of Asia's highest per capita case counts. Over 90% of adults are vaccinated. And the Australian state of Queensland plans to open to vaccinated travellers by December 17, allowing them in without quarantining. The Premier reckons by then they'll have vaccinated 80% of the population aged 16 and over. Nice to have you along. Stay safe and see you again soon.
Our next story is traumatic on many levels. You may find it disturbing. You may find yourself questioning humanity. You may lose faith in society's collective conscience. But that's exactly why we're telling you the story. Not to demoralize you, but to show you the mirror. The story begins in Philadelphia, America. It's October 13th, around 11 p.m. on a Wednesday, typically busy times, especially on public transport. A woman boarded the local train run by SEPTA, that's the Southeastern Pennsylvania Transportation Authority, SEPTA. Now listen closely to what happened next. A 35-year-old man came around and sat next to this woman. He tried to strike up a conversation. She was not interested. Over the next few minutes, he became aggressive. This is happening on a train, remember. He ripped off her clothes and sexually assaulted her. And this went on for 8 minutes. 8 minutes in a public train compartment. Was it empty? No, it wasn't. There were several people on board. They saw what this man was doing. They saw this woman being assaulted, but they did nothing. What were they scared of? Did they think the man was armed? Perhaps they did. Then why not call 911? Why not call the police? Nobody thought of that either. If they did not do it. They just sat frozen in the train while a woman was being raped in front of them. It was a transport authority official who ultimately called the cops. They arrested the suspect, this man, Fiston Nagoy. What about the survivor? When she was taken to hospital, officials say she's on the mend. Would you say there's been closure? Sure, the assaulter has been arrested. We're told there is CCTV evidence of the attack, plus witness testimonies. So chances are he is going to be punished. But what about the onlookers? The men and women who could have prevented this crime but chose not to. What is their punishment? Even the Philadelphia police were surprised by the onlookers' silence. Let me tell you what a senior police officer said. I'm shocked. I have no words for it. I just can't imagine seeing what you were seeing through your own eyes and seeing what this woman was going through. That no one would step in and help her. Anybody that was on that train has to look in the mirror and ask why they did not intervene or why they did not do something. I think it speaks for all of us. The train authorities too, they agree. They say this attack was preventable. Let me quote more. There were other people on the train who witnessed this horrific act, and it may have been stopped sooner if a rider called 911. It's as simple as that, really. It's a train. Most people are using their phones anyway. All they had to do was type 3 digits, 911, but they did not. They chose not to act for reasons only they can explain. And this is the latest instance of society failing women. We discuss these issues a lot in India. We discuss public apathy in India, but not so much in the West. We don't talk about it. Why is that? Because there's a feeling that the Western world has achieved women's safety, that it's done and dusted. But every now and then we are reminded of the very opposite. Like the Sarah Everard case in London, and now this one in Philadelphia. The fact is, women's safety is a global issue. It doesn't have borders. It doesn't have cultural differences. Until every woman is safe, no woman is safe anywhere in the world. So tonight, we're looking at the United States. 1 in 4 American women have reported domestic violence. 1 in 4. Reports say 64% of female homicides are perpetrated by a family member. So it's not just trains or public spaces. American women are not safe at home. A Department of Justice study found that 18% of American women are rape survivors. 18%. The annual cases are coming down, but one big problem remains, and that is underreporting. And this happens because in many cases, the perpetrator is a family member or a friend. Women don't want to report. In 2014, a study accused US police departments of fudging numbers. They're not encouraged to report. So the police is fudging numbers basically to create an illusion of success. And these numbers should worry politicians in America, but they don't. Take the state of Texas, for example. What have they done? They have enacted a new abortion law. There is no exception for survivors of rape and incest, no abortion for them. How do you describe such a law? You're punishing survivors. You're snatching away their hope for closure. This is 21st century America. Let me say this in conclusion. Politicians are the same everywhere. Onlookers are also the same everywhere. And the plight of women is also the same everywhere. Societies are slowly normalizing sexual violence, not accepting it, normalizing it. Like you would think of theft or corruption, an undeniable part of society. And that attitude led to what happened on this train in Philadelphia. That attitude is preventing tougher laws on gender violence as much in America and England as anywhere else in the world. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.
There is growing alarm over a cheap and highly addictive synthetic drug known as Flakka. It causes all sorts of paranoid, even deadly behavior. In South Florida, it's being compared to the crack cocaine epidemic of the 80s, and it's often sold through the mail. Our senior investigative correspondent, Cynthia McFadden, has the story from the epicenter of the epidemic, Fort Lauderdale.
Fort Lauderdale is under siege from a new synthetic drug called Flakka. It's creating a crisis for county resources and sending 20 users a day to the overwhelmed emergency room.
They have superhuman strength. They're psychotic, belligerent. It takes a lot of people to hold them down.
People like these, often stripping off their clothes as their temperatures soar up to 105 degrees. Flakka-related deaths in Broward County in the last year, 60.
Of all the drugs that I've seen, cocaine, amphetamines, heroin, Dilaudid, Oxycontin, this is the absolute worst.
Part of its appeal, it's so cheap.
$5 will get you high.
$5 get you high.
I remember just running, feeling like people were chasing me.
In March, Stephanie thought she was smoking pot, but it was laced with Flakka, a white granular powder.
Where did you end up? On top of the bridge? On top of a bridge, but I still was seeing people chase me and was still completely paranoid. So I jumped.
Falling 3 stories into the water.
30 seconds!
Fort Lauderdale police say most of their drug raids these days are for Flakka.
Fort Lauderdale Police Department, search warrants! I see your hands!
This raid yielding 140 doses and multiple users. Down the street at the Fort Lauderdale bus terminal, we saw 3 deals go down in under an hour.
The guy in the white t-shirt with the black pants.
The heavyset guy that's clapping his hands, yes.
Yeah. Known dealer.
Yes, ma'am.
Flakka is manufactured in China. It has been easily bought online and delivered in the mail here in the U.S.
Some of the companies even offer, if your product is seized by authorities, we'll replace it free of charge.
Dealers can get rich quick. A kilo that costs $1,500 online has a street value of $50,000.
This is the Silicon Valley of drug smuggling.
And it doesn't take a large drug smuggling organization to bring it in.
Sometimes the organization is a college kid who hires his friends.
There's not much of a barrier here for a startup.
We're calling it the devil's drug.
Ray Rapaglia runs a drug rehab center in Fort Lauderdale and says Flakka users present a challenge.
We're not as inclined to accept them in our program because we know that they might relapse. They pose safety threats to the rest of our residents.
But he decided to take a chance on Stephanie. Now 8 months clean and living, she says, for her daughter.
I know for sure that I'm lucky to be alive right now. It's by the grace of God that I'm alive.
Flocka, also known as gravel, has spread to other parts of the country, including Chicago, Houston, and Kentucky, as well as New York. Under pressure from the U.S., the Chinese recently made the manufacturing and exporting of Flocka illegal. The effect here in the U.S. is yet to be seen.
Frightening stuff, Cynthia. Hey, NBC News fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.
Tonight, the second part of our series on the ravages of the synthetic opioid fentanyl. Last night, we took you to Mexico to see where illegal cartels make it. Tonight, the deadly cost of the drug just across the U.S.-Mexico border in Arizona. Again, with the support of the Pulitzer Center, special correspondent Monica Villamizar and producer Zach Fannin report.
Because that's usually what you say.
A tall stretch of border wall
I'm
separates
sorry.
Nogales,
Don't
Arizona
hurt
from its
me.
sister city, Nogales, Mexico. Despite the heavy security measures, this area is a main smuggling route for fentanyl and other illicit drugs, both above and below ground. Border Patrol agent Kevin Hecht gave us a rare peek at subterranean tunnels designed a century ago to catch water runoff from Mexico. In recent years, the tunnels have also been used by drug smugglers.
They can tunnel through the floor in here, or tunnel through the wall and dig to a house or dig to a drainage pipe in the U.S. And then they come out of the pipe and they might go to a car, might have another short tunnel to the bottom of a car. Where that reflective yellow is, that's the border fence.
Hecht also showed us this more cramped training tunnel, where his agents learn how to navigate to the land below Nogales. He says smugglers connect their illicit tunnels to the existing ones.
If they know that there's a big long pipe here, why dig this when you can use it? So they'll breach it, and then they'll try and conceal it the best they can, and put the whatever they like. If they cut this out, they'll glue it back in or seal it back in, and then only open it when they need it. And then they'll crawl this to the next point where they don't have any more pipe, and then they'll dig another illicit tunnel.
So far in 2021, Hecht and his team have not intercepted any drugs in the tunnels. The vast majority of drug interceptions, including fentanyl, are caught by officers at U.S. ports of entry like this one in Nogales. Guadalupe Ramirez is the director of field operations for Customs and Border Protection's Tucson sector.
Years ago, they'd make a compartment in the gas tank, so half the gas tank had gas, the other half had narcotics. And then they started going to the quarter panels, they started going to the tires. Now, they're using drive shafts, transaxles, transmissions, even inside the motor. But I guarantee you, you can imagine it, it's been tried.
From August 2019 to July 2020, Ramirez and his officers seized just over 1,100 pounds of fentanyl. During that same period of time this year, they seized twice that amount, almost 2,300 pounds. 80 miles to the east, Sergeant Tim Williams works in the specialized unit for the Cochise County Sheriff's Department that tracks smugglers crossing a rural area of the border.
My main strategy is using this little camera that we have here. It's called a Buckeye. These things allow us to get real-time information about what's crossing and what's not. So we see a lot of like what we call military males, between 20 and 30-year-old males crossing the border.
The team was launched in 2017 and has caught over 400 drug smugglers so far. Their cameras have captured groups of drug mules crawling on the ground, and even this man with an automatic rifle. Just down the road, the border fence ended.
Where we're standing right now is where in Cochise County, the fence officially ends on our western border. And it doesn't start again until roughly around Nogales, which is about 70 to 80 miles away.
After President Biden was sworn in earlier this year, he signed an executive order that stopped construction of former President Trump's border wall. Today, scattered pieces of wall and construction equipment dot the U.S. side of the southern border, along with long stretches of fenceless border. Arizona State Senator Christine Marsh's 25-year-old son, Landon, was one of the last year's 90,000 overdose deaths. Since fentanyl is so inexpensive, it has made its way into virtually every illicit drug. Fentanyl is now found in cocaine, methamphetamine, heroin, and even the painkiller Percocet. Marsh says her son took a Percocet that was laced with fentanyl.
He had one wild night with a childhood friend, and that resulted in his death. And I contend that one wild night shouldn't be a death sentence. And he didn't have a habit of taking anything, and I unfortunately know that because I'm the one that went through all of this stuff. There's no evidence of any type of drug use.
After her son's death, Marsh discovered that these testing strips that can tell users if fentanyl has been added into other drugs were illegal in Arizona.
He was the kind of kid who was prepared for everything. I have no doubt that had the strips been available, he would have used it.
Earlier this year, Marsh brought a bill to Arizona's state Senate floor that proposed the legalization of these fentanyl testing strips. It was signed into law weeks ago.
The law was signed on the 1 year anniversary of Landon's death. I'm very grateful that there was that tiny bit of we're going to turn around and save some other lives on Landon's death date.
Next semester is all going to be research, and then I have to do 2 comprehensive exams.
This is Danielle. She didn't want to give us her last name. She's in her 30s and is currently a graduate student at a university in Phoenix.
I'm supposed to produce a dissertation prospectus, defend it. Yeah, then I get my fancy little cap and I'll be a doctor.
Danielle is probably not the image most people think of when they picture a heroin addict who's been using for over a decade.
I think that there's a reason that people kind of scapegoat the most visible type of struggling person that they see.
Just over a decade ago, Danielle hid her addiction from her employer. The result was so graphic, we are blurring our footage.
I would try to avoid injecting in my arms or somewhere visible. I would inject in my legs. I also wasn't aware that even if I wasn't sharing syringes, that reusing dull needles could traumatize the circulation of my legs.
First, she got a skin infection. She says over time that her tissue damage progressed.
Part of what you see is I have venous insufficiency now. So without that blood flow there to bring oxygen, the soft tissue dies and then it doesn't heal ever. If someone had just been like, hey, if you are going to continue injecting drugs, here's some things you can do to prevent this from becoming a lifelong issue for you.
Danielle wishes she could have received transparent information about how to use heroin as safely as possible. She said she had to suffer because drug users are often stigmatized.
All drug users are pretty much routinely despised, hated, and feared in our society.
Danielle's friend, Christopher Abert, the result was so graphic, we are blurring our footage.
I would try to avoid injecting in my arms or somewhere visible. I would inject in my legs. I also wasn't aware that even if I wasn't sharing syringes, that reusing dull needles could traumatize the circulation of my legs.
First, she got a skin infection. She says over time that her tissue damage progressed.
Part of what you see is I have venous insufficiency now. So without that blood flow there to bring oxygen, the soft tissue dies and then it doesn't heal ever. If someone had just been like, hey, if you are going to continue injecting drugs, here's some things you can do to prevent this from becoming a lifelong issue for you.
Danielle wishes she could have received transparent information about how to use heroin as safely as possible. She said she had to suffer because drug users are often stigmatized.
All drug users are pretty much routinely despised, hated, and feared in our society.
Danielle's friend, Christopher Abert, who is also a drug user, is the founder of the Southwest Recovery Alliance. Despite having the word recovery in the group's name, their main focus is to help decriminalize drugs in the U.S. and help drug users reduce harm.
The idea of focusing in on the drug itself is the problem, and it's not the conditions and concurrent illnesses that accompany some people's drug use that are actually the root of the problem. So if you focus on this idea of this chaotic drug user who's dangerous, then you lose the picture of the fact that human beings have been doing drugs for a millennium and doing them without the what is ailing our society, like right now: death, disconnection, destruction, disease.
The group also laments that fentanyl has flooded the illegal drug market and has made heroin harder to procure.
I can inject heroin. About 8 hours later, I will start coming out of that high. And then eventually, withdrawal set in and I'll have to start again. But with fentanyl, it's about 4 hours after I do the shot. So people are having to use more and more and more. Me personally, I would much prefer heroin.
115 miles south in Tucson, the newly elected Democratic County Attorney, Laura Conover, is changing how the criminal justice system treats drug users. Today, that means passing out food aid to her constituents.
We are in and out of neighborhoods that have been decimated by the war on drugs. What we want to look at is a new way forward in making sure that we are not continuing to attempt to incarcerate our way out of substance use disorder.
At the New Jerusalem Baptist Church, Conover is trying to personally connect with this Black and Latino community that's been disproportionately affected by the war on drugs.
Good to see you. How are you?
To get the word out that her office is not prosecuting all drug offenses.
You're talking about simple possession because there's a substance use disorder. We are looking to make sure that we are moving those people back into the medical and behavioral health realm where that belongs.
However, Conover cautions her office is not legalizing the sale of narcotics.
We are talking about high-level distributors, those who are making a profession of causing harm in our community. We have the resources and labor ready to hold them accountable and prosecute them.
For the past 50 years, the demand for drugs in the United States has proven insatiable.
If addiction is always going to be with us, then let's treat it like the illness that it is. When we bring people back to healthy lives, then the demand for the product goes away.
From crack to heroin to methamphetamine to the most deadly illicit opioid America has seen, fentanyl. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Monica Villamizar in Arizona.
Can you walk me through what happened inside of that pharmacy just now? What do they sell?
They sell everything besides crack, cocaine, ecstasy, and all of it, and LSD. But all the drugs like cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, weed, Xanax, Adderall, ketamine, cigarettes, and Disneyland.
Medical tourism to Mexico from the US is huge, with an estimated 3 million inbound medical travelers in 2020. Medication is cheaper in Mexico, and you can buy most drugs without a prescription. While most people are able to find the care they desperately need, some are also buying cheap, unregulated meds without knowing they're fake. The ingredients can be completely unknown, and in recent years, the DEA have seized counterfeit medication laced with the deadly opioid fentanyl. It's estimated that 8 million people consume illicit medication in Mexico every year. I want to explore this black market industry, meet the dealers, the people combating this medical crime, and the people risking their lives for their own health. My father is a pharmacist. He works in a very highly regulated environment where, you have to have a prescription, you have to go to a doctor to get your medicine. But then with my friends, they come to Mexico and they don't have to come with a prescription. They don't have to potentially even see a doctor. They just go to one of the pharmacies and just ask for the medication they're looking for and they get it. So it's as quick as that. So as much as it's simple and easy, it also makes me wonder how dangerous that can be. I'm heading near the US-Mexico border to Zona Norte, a red light area of Tijuana, where medical tourists often travel to pick up cheaper meds. There I'm meeting with a former opioid user who has regularly traveled to pharmacies on the border for around 10 years to buy Percocet without a prescription after he got hooked on opioids in the US. He wishes to remain anonymous and is going to secret film inside of one of these pharmacies, pick up some of the Percocet, and then I'm going to test them to find out what's really in them.
What's up, man? How you doing, G? Doing good. Cool. Yeah, man. Can I just get 2 Perk 30s? The 2 Percocet 30s milligrams? Yeah. Okay. Money.
How did you get into Percocet?
Okay, so a year or 2 ago, like, I remember trying to buy some heroin, and then somebody gave like a blue pill. This is way better, it's Perk 30s or whatever. I didn't know that's not gonna touch me. Because I was just like, Perk 30, like, Oxycontin 80s, it's Perk 80s, that's what they always call themselves. I was like, this ain't gonna touch me, bro. But he's like, no, take it for free, trust me. Like, well, long story short, I took a hit, and it's fucking bleeding out. And I already had a tolerance to opiates. You know, but what the fuck is that? That's not real. Like, Percocet, whatever. I was like, that shit ain't real, bro. I was like, I do heroin, that shit put me out my ass.
Do you know anyone who's died from consuming these pills?
I do. Yeah, a close friend of mine had a tolerance to it. Ended up taking a full Percocet and yeah, to the body.
Do you have any idea of what might be in them?
I have no idea.
So how would you feel if I told you we were going to test it?
Yeah.
Yeah, you're cool with that?
Yeah, I want to know.
You want to know?
Yeah.
I'm going to use a portable spectrometer intended for Border Patrol to test if the drugs are counterfeit. All right, this is going to be a little tricky. My list looks so shady right now. Now, I think I've grounded it enough.
I don't think necessarily any minorities are well treated in Quebec. I can understand if he's talking about like rich white men who are Anglophone.
Canada's francophone minorities dream of mastering so many institutions. No minority in Canada is better served than English-speaking Quebecers, and we are proud of that.
Quebec Premier François Legault called English-speaking Quebecers the most well-served minority group in Canada, saying they have their own institutions like schools, hospitals, and even media. But many here in Montreal feel their rights are being trampled on.
None of these institutions were given to us by the province. We now contribute through our taxes to these institutions. But what we see happening is that with subsequent legislation, there is an erosion of these institutions, and that is incredibly worrisome for all English-speaking Quebecers.
When we look, for example, at the financing coming from the government for the CUSUM, for Dawson, for McGill, for Anglophone institutions, I think we cannot say, like I read, that all the money came from the individuals. They came from the government of Quebec, and I'm proud of that and will continue to do so.
These institutions have become institutions for all Quebecers. So, yes, the government contributes to these institutions. They are important to the fabric of Quebec.
Over 1 million Quebecers identify as English speakers in a province of 8 million plus. Legault says access to English services would only include historical Anglophones, eliminating the majority of people who immigrated to Quebec in the past several decades and their children.
Somebody coming from Jamaica, even if they speak English, they have to send their children to French schools. Again, it's a question of survival for French in Quebec.
This eligibility clause that he's talking about would, in our estimation, impact 300 to 500 English-speaking Quebecers who need healthcare and social service care in English.
In my view, there is some necessity in protecting the language. I think maybe they're going on the wrong way doing so.
In Montreal, Brittany Enriquez, City News.
It's time for business news with Richard Southern, and let's start with the story that's generating plenty of talk today. Richard, Facebook is pondering a possible name change.
Can you believe it? Any idea? What would you change the name to, Erica? Do you have any idea?
I don't know. The Happy Place? Maybe
The Happy
it'll
Place?
change, what it's been doing lately, but yeah.
Maybe. People were actually joking online. What should we change it to? People were saying maybe Faceplant, or I can't believe it's not Facebook, Zuckerstein, or what have you. Anyways, those are comical options. Facebook is going to come out with a serious one, reportedly. The online publication The Verge reporting that the social media company is planning to announce a name change as early as next week. What? Important to note, though, that it's reportedly not the app itself that's changing. Facebook would still be Facebook. It's the parent company that would change its name, much like what we saw with Google, where, you go on google.com, it's still there, but the parent company's name is Alphabet. Would be kind of the same thing. It would signal Facebook's intention to grow beyond social media into more of a tech conglomerate. Facebook already, of course, owns Instagram and WhatsApp and Oculus and other brands, and a name change would organize those under one umbrella. It also comes, as you alluded to, Erica, at a time of some turbulence for the company. A whistleblower recently alleged that Facebook was prioritizing profits ahead of the safety of its users. So we'll look for whatever that name change is coming.
Okay, it's no secret everything costs more these days, and that's driving the inflation rate to levels we haven't seen in quite some time.
Yeah, you and I have talked quite a bit about this lately because it's been, a story that's impacting a lot of people's wallets, Eric. And Stats Canada backed up a lot of that reporting today, informing us that inflation hit an 18-year high in September, up 4.4% year on year. Almost every single category they looked at went up in price. We're looking at food here. Food was up 3.9%, with beef up 15% over the past year. Cooking oil up 27%. Price of gasoline up 32%. Shelter costs up 4.8%. You name it, it's costing more for a myriad of different reasons. One of the big knock-on effects here, Erica, could be inflation rates going up by the Bank of Canada. Now, they use that to control inflation, after all. The economist at Scotiabank today predicting we could see as many as 8 interest rate hikes over the next 2 years. That could cause trouble for Canadians who are a bit stretched financially to the limit right now.
All right, and speaking of everything costing more, the holidays are also just around the corner, and that means big business for Canada Post.
Sure is, Erica. If you're looking for a little extra work, maybe you'll take up a job as working for Canada Post as a letter carrier. They're looking for people right now. Canada Post says they're looking to hire for seasonal positions in the GTA, in Kitchener, in Ottawa, in Hamilton. They're looking for postal clerks who, sort mail, who operate some of the mail processing equipment. They say you got to be able to work nights and weekends and all this, but it pays $21.80 an hour, so not too shabby. No experience required, though they say some warehouse experience would be an asset. Wouldn't be a good job for me. I remember a couple of months ago I had to send a letter. I'm a terrible millennial, so I had to go into the post office, ask the nice lady what I was doing. Can you believe that, Erica?
I don't even know how to send a letter anymore.
No.
My goodness.
Look, I spoke yesterday about that death in Essex, England, of Sir David Amos, a distinguished member of the House of Commons, stabbed multiple times during a regular Friday meeting with his constituents. Scotland Yard has formally declared the incident as terrorism after a 25-year-old was arrested. When I spoke a couple of weeks ago to Peggy Grandy, she argued, as did I, that the abandonment of Afghanistan to the Taliban may set in train what is now being described by some as a lone wolf attack. But responsible figures in Britain today are saying it is nothing like a lone wolf attack. Instead, Hugo Micheron, a doctor in political science and the author of the 2020 book, The French Jihadism, where Micheron interviewed 80 jihadists serving time for terror offences in French prisons. They explained to Micheron their journey from disenchantment or delinquency to Islamism and how it gave them purpose, motivation and fellowship. But as Gavin Mortimer writes today ominously, quote, above all, it imbued in the jihadists a hatred for Western society, a contempt shared by British, Belgian, Norwegian and all European extremists, unquote. The question must be asked, therefore, where will they strike next? And remember, this assassination of a British MP came 2 days after an Islamic attack in Norway and raises concerns that the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan may lead to a resurgence of similar attacks. Let's go to Peggy again this week. Peggy, thank you for your time. What has been the reaction in America to this? And are our intelligence resources equal to nailing these people before the event?
Well, thank you always, Alan, for having me on. And what happened in the UK, of course, is a horrific tragedy. And our elected officials should expect to get verbal assaults, but they should never expect to have physical attacks on them. And I'm afraid that that will make our politicians less accessible and less willing to engage with their constituents in the future. But how that connects to Afghanistan is we know that terror is on the rise there. American military leaders told us as much, that terror groups are reconstituting there. And we know that when terrorism is left unchecked, it will continue to expand and recruit all around the world. And so Americans and the world should be very worried about this, especially when American military brass is saying that it's of great concern to them.
Absolutely. So I know, for example, that the Afghanistan girls football squad have fled Afghanistan after the country was taken over by the Taliban. They'll hopefully be relocated in the UK in the next few weeks. But the 35 young players and their families about
Interesting.
I want to speak to the historic English-speaking community of Quebec.
Oh man.
You are an integral part of Quebec. As a historic community, you have your own. I want to speak to the historic. I want to speak.
Sad. I wanted free chicken. Free chicken. It's great.
Hear this nonsense? We're going to war. We're all gonna die. That makes this way more fun. Oh, now I got in my head, you fucker. What up, Jack?
Imagine if we didn't have all this junk in here, you'd have enough space to like have like room to breathe.
Hence why I'm doing this, so I can put stuff in here.
There's just no room.
Come on, Char. Got an anime to watch. What?
That's just fucking it.
Open wide.
Tired.
please? Get off.
No. Can't make me.
Fucking dollar store fresh. Oh yeah. There's like a fucking party down the street apparently.
Oh yeah.
The gym building. You know, like above it, it looks kind of like an office.
Yeah.
There's like the empty lot with like usually building debris underneath it. Above there, they have like now a sheet as a curtain, like a whorehouse, and there's like some crazy lights going on.
Oh.
And fucking cop rolled up next to me on Pool Street, and like just stopped. I was like, and he's like the passenger cop got out, and then went into like a Mazda, like a unmarked silver Mazda. Pretty sure I heard him say like something about that I'm running away from him.
You?
Yeah, I think he said something about running, but I was just trying to like get out of the way because they were just like stopped and like both the two of them got out of the car. They were both like staring at me. I'm like, go, Jack, go. Don't you fucking hate when cops do that? I fucking can't stand when they do that. When they like stare at you and you're like, am I supposed to know what I should be doing? Or you can just tell me.
You want to open the window too? No, open the window.
Yeah, no open the window instead. So I want her ready to go.
So it really smells like paint in here.
Does it smell like paint?
Yeah.
Well, I'm almost done. Oh, my shoulder's so itchy. Fuck you. You're the one with the dirty asshole. Oh, it's fucking shit. You made me have to poo. What, Jack? What? Will be. Come on, mister. What? What? We'll get her.
There are few crimes worse than sexual exploitation of a minor.
As criticism mounts, silence from Councillor-elect Sean Chu. Calls to resign from his soon-to-be mayor have yet gone unanswered, and there's little anyone can do should he decide to stay here at City Hall.
Under current law, there is no legal basis for removing Sean Chu from office.
She says it would be a strong argument for recall, but that legislation hasn't yet been proclaimed by the province. A recount of votes is also underway to see if Chu's victory will stand. In the meantime, Chu faces increased political pressure to resign.
If these claims are true and these revelations are correct, then I think it would be the honorable thing to step aside.
Michelle Rempel-Garner, the Conservative MP for Calgary-Nose Hill, has added her voice, saying in a tweet, "I have supported Mr. Chu in the past, but firmly withdraw all such support in light of these reports." The province could do an informal review, but it wouldn't have the power to enact change, and they would have to be careful with UCP ties to Chu.
Clearly, there are a number of people in the UCP government that have either donated to or been closely associated with Sean Chu, and because of that, there would have to be an independent investigation or review.
Williams says Chu's constituents would lose in all of this.
The biggest problem here is that he will not be able to represent the people of Ward 4 effectively because he won't be able to participate in a number of committees and activities.
She says, for example, he would have to recuse himself from any matters involving police.
And if he doesn't resign, he will be increasingly isolated, not just on council, but in terms of his ability to work with the rest of council and city administration and getting the work done.
In Calgary, Stephanie Lasuk, City News.
The Toronto Raptors are going to host the Washington Wizards in their home opener. Fans starting to gather outside the Scotiabank Arena for something that they've been waiting for over 600 days. Yes, they've been waiting 20 months for the Raptors to be able to play a regular season game here on home court inside the Scotiabank Arena. For the fans that get in here tonight, they're all getting this special shirt that says "We Back," and it certainly has been a long journey for Canada's only NBA team to get back north of the border.
Kyle, count it, and the foul.
In the last 20 months, the Raptors played a bubble-like scenario in Disney World, then had to call Tampa, Florida home for the last season because of the ongoing pandemic. They had multiple members of the organization test positive for COVID-19, and just a few months ago, had another huge change to the franchise when they did a sign and trade with the Miami Heat, shipping Lowry south of the border. Their last season home opener was actually only 10 months ago in Tampa. Here was that opening night roster. Fans never got a chance to see a number of those players play in Toronto. They weren't able to see Norman Powell or Kyle Lowry's last game as a Raptor. Now look at the changes. Here's tonight's opening night roster. The Raptors have 6 players returning from last year's opening day roster and 4 members from the championship roster of 2019, including Canadian Chris Boucher.
You know, with my family, with the fans here in Toronto, I think it's a good opportunity for me to show what people are doing, but also play in front of my family and my friends. You know, when we're at the Tampa, even though I feel like I had a great season, I couldn't do it in front of my family and fans. So I'm really excited to, pursue what I've been doing and, just keep on helping this team to get to where we want to be.
Here's Achua gliding, lays it up and through.
What are the realistic expectations of this new look Raptors roster?
I think if you're being realistic about it, looking at this team, as much as you might be the most diehard Raptor fan overall, or you're Masai Ujiri sitting in the office, I think realistically you say, all right, we're not as good as we were a couple of years ago based on overall talent, let alone individual talent. However, I still think they're a very solid team. I think they're going to be a very difficult team to play against on any given night because of their length and their versatility and their athleticism, and because of the way that they're coached as well. And that there is pure talent, period. And to that point, then, I think there's every reason to believe, if you're a Raptor fan, that this is or should still be a playoff team.
Now, with the pandemic rent freeze set to expire at the end of the year, many housing advocates fear that many families could end up homeless. And now they're calling for that rent freeze to last at least until the pandemic is over.
Notices of rent increases have already been sent out to some tenants across the province.
We are concerned. We have been concerned for many, many years.
Warnings of evictions and families living beyond their means, just a fraction of the concerns being heard from housing advocates.
Well, this tenant or this ACOR member that came and she received $14 increase. But if people only have stuff in a fixed income and they only had $75 to live, what happened in 3 years is this person is going to be in the streets.
To help renters during the pandemic, the province passed legislation to freeze rent last year. For 2022, Ontario has set an increased guideline of 1.2%. But with the Canada Recovery Benefit also set to end in a few days, tenant groups want the government to consider extending the freeze until people are able to get back on their feet.
If we want to recover, it should be at least for 5 years. Because that way will allow the market to be healthy until we start to build more housing.
Many of the families that we see have very young children, and if they have difficulties paying their rent, the fear of losing their housing is very real, and the impact to the children is significant.
Gladys Wong is the executive director of Neighborhood Information Post and is working with the Toronto Rent Bank, assisting renters who are having a hard time paying rent by granting them interest-free loans and grants. She says the requests for their services have gone up by 43% from 2019 to 2020.
Based on our numbers, 2/3 of our applicants, of our rent bank applicants, are applying to the rent bank because of COVID-related plus employment-related issues. We've got applicants whose rent is actually 80 or 90% of their monthly income. So that's very, very significant.
Wong says with the rent freeze coming to an end, she expects that number to only increase. And like tenant groups, there are fears families won't be able to keep a steady roof over their heads in 2022.
With the rent being increased in January of next year, we are very sure that the number of applications to the rent bank will continue to go up.
If we move the city, we should be able to live here. So this is something that is very concerning, and it should be the first concern for the government.
Now, landlords need to give tenants 90 days notice if they do plan on increasing the rent. So that means that tenants that will have to pay more in January should have received a notice by now. Also, if you believe that you've received an improper rent increase, you can dispute that at the Landlord Tenant Board within 12 months.
These grades aren't for students. They're for businesses, based on how likely the company is to pay its debts back. A company like Microsoft has the best grade possible, AAA, since they have a long history of paying people on time.
The internet is about driving profitability.
But a newer company like Tesla has a BB rating,
Fundamentally change the equation. You've got to have an all-electric vehicle.
and that affects their interest rates. Microsoft pays its investors 2.5% interest. Tesla pays a bit more at 5.3%. The riskier the grade, the higher the interest rate. But it's not just companies that have grades. Countries do too. The United States, for a really long time, had a AAA rating until
lawmakers have just 2 more days to raise the nation's debt ceiling and avoid a catastrophic default on its loans, which could create turmoil in the U.S. economy and worldwide.
the US has a weird thing called the debt ceiling, which is just a limit on how much debt the country can take on. If the national debt reaches that limit, the US might not be able to pay its investors. The US regularly comes close to hitting it, but the government always ends up raising it. Until 2011, when it almost didn't. After that, the US was downgraded for the first time due to, quote, political risk. Since then, Congress and the president have had to raise it 7 more times. It's becoming an almost annual task. And of course, it always goes super swell.
The entire basis of the Republican strategy is we're going to shut down the government or cause economic chaos if we don't get 100% of what we want.
This isn't some damn game.
Our Republican friends need to stop playing Russian roulette.
Russian roulette with the economy.
In the last 20 years, the US has borrowed more and more money. The national debt is at an all-time high. But how should we feel about this debt? And what happens if we don't pay it back? The US national debt is nearing $29 trillion with a capital T. Depending on when you watch this, it might already be there. It's best not to look at it as a number, but instead as a comparison to the size of the economy. You'll see the US takes on more debt when the country spends a lot, because of wars or because of investments needed during recessions and now pandemics. And the department in charge of all this is the US Treasury. They collect taxes and spend them to fund the government. And for the record, it's Congress and the president who decide how much taxes should be and where the money should be spent. The Treasury just handles the flow of money. But for essentially ever, they approve more spending than they bring in with taxes. So the Treasury has to make up that difference by taking on debt. And it does that by selling bonds. They can vary, but generally it works like this. You buy a $1,000 30-year bond at a locked-in 2% interest rate. Every year, the Treasury sends you $20, the 2% interest you've earned. And after 30 years, you can cash out the bond and get your $1,000 back. It's a win-win situation. The US gets money to fund the government, and you make some profit on a safe investment. More than a third of these bonds, and therefore the total US debt, are owned by Americans and American companies. Investors and also banks, local governments, and even pension funds keep their money in bonds. And the largest part is owned by the federal government. The federal government owns part of the federal government's debt. The money for Social Security is actually kept in bonds. So is the money for Medicare and federal pensions. The Federal Reserve has bonds too. Foreign investors only own a quarter of the US debt. And while Chinese investors used to have the largest share, Japanese investors actually own more now. They own around 4% of all US debt. And it is a lot of debt. Of all the developed countries, the US has the 4th largest debt compared to the size of the economy. So is this bad?
The really, really frustrating answer is we don't know.
Debt has pros and cons. One question is, what are you doing with the debt?
When you're in an economic recession or an emergency, not only should you borrow, you should borrow a lot. But what you shouldn't do is borrow when your economy is strong and the political inconvenience of paying for things is too high.
Another really important question is, what are interest rates? In recent years, interest rates have been very low. That tends to make it easier to borrow and sustain that borrowing. Where we are now doesn't make me, as of now, very nervous.
I worry about the debt a lot more than he does.
While all countries take on debt, only these two have debt ceilings. Denmark's, however, is kept so high, they're not going to come close to hitting it. Unlike the United States, where the government is constantly having to raise the debt ceiling to pay for spending they already approved.
That's the big problem with the debt limit, is it's internally contradictory. The government passes a law that says you have to spend 10. It passes a law saying you can only collect 8 in taxes. And then it passes another law saying you're not allowed to borrow 2.
If the US does hit the debt ceiling, it would mean the Treasury couldn't issue any more bonds, so no more debt revenue. Taxes would still be coming in, but that's not enough to cover all these responsibilities. So maybe they stop paying federal employees or stop spending money for programs. But at some point, they won't be able to pay the interest to these investors or cash out Social Security bonds. That's called a default. It's never happened yet.
You couldn't do more to sabotage your financial system than default.
Interest rates could rise based on a reassessment that the United States was considerably riskier than people had thought before. When government bond interest rates go up, that usually means that other interest rates are going up.
If you borrow for anything, whether it's for a dishwasher, a car, college, or your credit card, that's going to become more costly. We're going to lose jobs. Wages won't go up as high.
We could be like these countries and just not have a debt limit, or have one so high it's never a threat to the economy. Because if Congress and the president really want to take on less debt, they can change the tax system or reduce spending.
The debt limit does make sense if you are a functioning Congress. They're saying we need to put in place some policy to make sure that we don't borrow more than we mean to, or we stop and we pause and we check on the borrowing. That certainly isn't how it is working.
I think the simplest thing would just be to repeal it. That would be like almost every other country in the world.
Even if the US never actually defaults on its debt, just the mere political fights and will they or won't they unease could make the United States a less desirable place to invest.
It's long been seen as this is kind of the safest asset that you can invest in. And so it's given the US a lot of advantages. But the more our political system is so polarized and dysfunctional, the more that it becomes a little bit questioned of whether the US should have the incredible advantage that it has thus far.
In 1856, a scientist named Eunice Foote conducted an experiment. She filled one tube with regular air and another with carbon dioxide, put thermometers in them, and placed them in the sun. And she noticed the tube of carbon dioxide got a lot hotter and stayed hot longer. She published her results, noting that an atmosphere of that gas would give to our Earth a high temperature. 3 years later,
Yes, Jack.
Edwin Drake struck oil in Western Pennsylvania. 100 years after that first well, the American oil industry celebrated its centennial, and they invited the physicist Edward Teller, one of the inventors of the atomic bomb, to make a speech about the future of energy. We probably have to look for additional fuel supplies, he told the crowd, because the extra carbon emitted from burning fossil fuels causes a greenhouse effect, which he believed would be sufficient to melt the ice cap and submerge New York.
By 1965, scientists were confident enough to formally warn a U.S. president, Lyndon B. Johnson.
A decade later, Exxon's own scientists were making grim predictions. By 1988, it was front page news. And since then, we've kept pumping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere at an accelerating rate.
We have a world economy today that depends on fossil fuels for most of its energy.
A third of it from oil.
In It's a tremendous irony that the very substances that helped us achieve this level of development today are now the very substances that endanger the future of civilization as we know it.
Governments are starting to agree that we shouldn't let the world warm more than 1.5 degrees centigrade. And we're on track to blow past that by 2030. So why is it so hard to turn off the tap? And can we do it in time?
Industrial nations have developed a great dependency on oil. It has added a new freedom to our lives.
The invaluable stocks of oil in these exotic islands, their wealth is cracking the old light of Arabia wide open.
Nigerian government love the oil more than our lives.
Increasing amounts of carbon dioxide surround us. If man continues to abuse his environment, Earth too may become barren.
The story of oil is a story of geopolitical clash, technological advancement, and intense competition.
The story of oil is a story of inequality. It's a story of dominance. The Nigeria in which I was born in was just a couple of years before the ending of the British colonial rule.
At the time, it was an agricultural economy.
Cotton from the north, cocoa from the west, and rubber from the Midwest.
And in the area where Nemo grew up, fishing.
The Niger Delta is an area that is crisscrossed by water bodies, creeks, streams, rivers, estuaries, which is the breeding ground for most fish in the Gulf of Guinea.
It was so fertile, fishermen could just leave their traps at high tide and pick them up at low tide. And in the evenings,
children would sit around in the moonlight and the elders would share stories.
They didn't know they were sitting on one of the most oil-rich regions on Earth. Until the British granted Shell and BP an exclusive permit to explore for oil. They struck black gold in 1956.
Nigerians were extremely hopeful that the discovery of oil in their communities would bring about positive changes in their economic well-being, in the health conditions of the people, in terms of employment and everything.
And just a few years later, Nigeria won independence. The future looked bright. After all, fossil fuels had transformed other countries. The world's wealthiest nations had once been much poorer.
The amount of work a person could do was the amount they could do with their hands, possibly helped by a horse or mule. Coal was the first discovery that changed all that.
Ancient organisms in oceans and swamps had soaked up the power of the sun. Their fossils compressed over millions of years into coal and a mile or more down into natural gas and crude oil. Burning coal, this time capsule of the sun's energy, helped Britain become the first industrialized nation and the most powerful empire the world had ever seen. And then oil came along.
And that started off this kind of boom. It was discovered that gasoline, which had been kind of this waste product when they refined oil, was actually a very good fuel for cars.
Oil was the most energy-packed liquid source of power that you could get your hands on.
Right from the beginning, it was very important to the British Navy, who wanted to have access to British-controlled oil.
It started as a syndicate of private investors that went on a journey and an adventure to find oil in the foothills of the Zagros Mountains in Persia. That was the start of the Anglo-Persian Oil Company.
Later renamed British Petroleum, and they were just in time.
The First World War began with cavalry charges and people on horses, and it ended with airplanes, with tanks, with trucks.
When the Allied Navy switched to using oil instead of coal, those ships could go further before refueling.
Oil put the world in motion.
People were finding newfound freedom, driving all over the place, flying all over the place.
It's pulled millions of people out of poverty.
What oil did was really create the modern world.
Pipelines were built, roads were built, gas stations were built, refineries were built. Everybody wanted investment in oil and gas
But the profits were lopsided.
The ocean of crude oil underneath Persia's desert led the way to the Middle East oil boom.
Iran was making just a fraction of the profits from their own oil, while the British raked in the rest. And they decided they were sick of that deal.
Long smoldering Iranian nationalists made clear their intention to seize the oil industry and expropriate the British company.
So in 1953, Britain and the US engineered a coup, overthrowing Iran's democratically elected leader to install the Shah.
because they felt that he was more amenable to having a great relationship with the West.
Which is how a young Lord Brown ended up there.
I spent many years as a child in Iran when my father was working in the oil industry.
And when he turned 18, he started working for BP himself.
I joined the oil industry believing it was a place where you could solve problems that no one had solved before. How could you use oil to go further and farther?
At the time, BP was one of 7 companies from just 3 countries that controlled 85% of the world's oil reserves. And over in Nigeria, they quickly learned that oil didn't mean prosperity for everyone. Under colonial rule, the British had forced diverse states into a single nation. And after independence, Nemo's home region announced it was seceding.
As a young child, I did not fully understand what was at stake. To me, the most exciting thing was that there was going to be a new nation called Biafra.
But this region encompassed most of the Niger Delta and its oil reserves. So when the Nigerian government declared war, the British gave their support.
My village was more or less a war front.
The government blockaded the region. It's estimated that more than 1 million civilians died of starvation.
I still hear voices in my head sometimes of people asking for help, crying for food. It's not something that you forget in a hurry.
Biafra surrendered in 1970. The next year, Nigeria joined OPEC, an alliance of oil-producing nations that wanted to take back control of their resources. And in the 70s, they wielded their power, raising oil prices, with some countries boycotting the U.S. for their military support of Israel.
Suddenly turned into a crisis and a shock to the political order.
Gasoline stations ran dry. Airlines cut back flight schedules. Factories were forced to close.
And in 1979, when the Iranians overthrew the Shah and took back control of their oil, prices went through the roof again. And while that was bad for oil consumers,
Ridiculous, you just don't know where it's gonna stop.
it was great for oil producers. Nigeria became one of the wealthiest countries in Africa. But after that 70s boom, oil prices crashed, and so did Nigeria's economy.
The idea of the resource curse is that countries don't necessarily do better just because they have an abundance of natural resources. It can throw off the currency valuation, make other industries less competitive,
And cause economic turmoil and corruption.
The problem is not the resource. The problem is how the resource is exploited.
It's one thing for a country to get oil revenues. It's another thing is who gets the money and where does it go?
A large chunk of that has been taken up by transnational corporations.
And the money that stays goes to the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation, which is owned by the government and is also in charge of regulating the country's oil industry.
So when you have an operator who is also a regulator,
And since independence, billions have disappeared.
that level of corruption, it corrupts not just people economically, it corrupts the political system.
And there were other costs. In the Niger Delta, over 50 years of spillage has created 27,000 miles of toxic oil swamps.
Kids are swimming in water covered in crude oil. Life expectancy is at 41 years, maybe one of the lowest in the entire world.
Fishermen can no longer just leave their traps at high tide.
You having fisher folks who go into the rivers and toil all day and all night and catch nothing.
And no more moonlit nights.
The gas flares set up by the oil corporations burn 24 hours every day.
And on top of all that, Nigeria is a hot, dry country which means it's more sensitive to rising temperatures. And as of 2020, the global average temperature has increased by more than 1 degree centigrade.
Heat waves are getting stronger, more frequent, and more deadly. It is powering hurricanes that intensify more quickly. Wildfires are burning much greater area. Climate change is not responding to our annual emissions, what we're putting out this year. It's responding to our cumulative emissions.
And so the rich countries caused the problems. We're the ones who put out all these carbon emissions over all these years.
But developing countries are facing the brunt of the costs. It's already pushed millions of people to flee their homes.
The clock is ticking, and we can really wonder whether there's any hope that we can pull this off, or whether we've come to the precipice as the human race.
What's at risk? Not the planet, it will survive. What's at risk is us.
The world emits around 50 billion tons of greenhouse gases a year, more than it ever has. And governments agree we need to get to net zero by 2050.
And achieve carbon neutrality.
We're going to move to net zero and a transition in all countries.
Aspiration to reach net zero.
Significantly reducing emission
legislation for net zero.
Nigeria has rolled out institutional frameworks to cut emission by 20%.
This issue is not like the coronavirus, where you need one vaccine to deal with one virus and its variants. This is a very broad issue that needs lots of solutions, and it's going to require a lot of technology that really hasn't been developed yet.
But there have been dramatic changes. Wind and solar power are now cheaper than coal in a lot of countries. Battery technology is improving rapidly. Governments are investing in more hydropower and nuclear plants. Electric cars are getting cheaper every year. And for long-haul ships and planes, engineers are working on biofuels and liquid hydrogen. And people are working on solutions for every piece of this pie. And the current goal isn't to get to zero carbon emissions.
People are targeting net zero. Net zero. They're saying we will produce carbon, but we will offset it
by restoring forests, wetlands,
techniques in the ocean,
which can help soak up more carbon, or carbon capture technology, which is still expensive. And that's an issue with a lot of these solutions. So many governments are trying to tip the balance. More than 40 countries have a price on carbon to make burning fossil fuels more costly. And over the past decade, the US has been moving from coal to natural gas. The result of fracking.
Sinner. What? You got red paint on your shirt. Uh-huh. I am chewing. I chew with my mouth closed. Yeah. I chew with my mouth closed and drool all over the place. I stuck my gear in my house. Oh, I didn't dream that up the night.
No, you were like, don't hate me. And I was like, what? Okay.
Well, did you?
Super weird thing to follow up with. Like, you, and I was wondering why you're so quiet when you're sleeping too. And then you just started chewing. And I was like, are you still chewing your gum? You're like, mm-hmm. It's like, spit that out. You didn't even need to open your eyes. Just look into my hand. I was like, oh.
Yay. I don't know what it is. I just want to chew gum at night. Bubble gum. No. What? You horn dog, stop by me with your hand-like guns.
Bless, bless.
Mm-hmm.